God bless you guys and welcome to day number 7 in this 20-day devotional on Holy Week, where we're going to be studying and we are studying the events that led Jesus up to the cross, his death, and his resurrection. And then today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic of when Judas betrayed Jesus and Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. The verses that we're going to be looking at comes out of the book of John, chapter 18. And we're going to read verse 2 and 3, and these are going to be our starting point verses. John chapter 18, verse 2 and 3 reads this way. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Wow. So I just want to start off by saying that the signs of Judas betraying Jesus were everywhere. I mean, as you follow the story in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you read, you see that Judas, there was gonna be something happening with Judas. And only until after Jesus died and resurrected did the disciples really pick up all the signals and the signs that there was something off with Judas. So, but the disciples didn't understand that. They didn't see it at the time. Now, I want to give you a little bit of it, prep and show you the environment that led up to the arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. Before the Last Supper, right before the Last Supper, before Jesus calls the disciples to that upper room so he can institute the Last Supper, the Bible shows us that Judas, he went to the chief priests. Now we know that the chief priests were looking for ways to kill Jesus. They were upset with him. They didn't like his teaching. He was correcting them. He was rebuking them. And he was coming with authority. And the chief priests, they didn't like that. Okay, they didn't like that Jesus came to disrupt their little business and their system, and that he came to teach everyone the right way to do things. So they were trying to find ways to kill Jesus. Well, the Bible says that Judas went to the chief priests with a plan to give Jesus up. We find that one of the places we find that is in the book of Mark, chapter 14, verse 10 and 11. And it says, Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Wow. So Jesus, remember, Jesus was Jesus was one of the he called Judas to be with him. Judas was one of the treasurers. He was the treasurer of the 12 disciples. So he was involved in money. Okay? Judas goes up to the high priest and he has a plan. I'm going to give Jesus over, and what do they promise him? They promise to give him money. It's not a coincidence that the Bible says that the love or that the root of all evil is the love of money. And if you read that whole chapter, it talks about that you're willing to do anything just to pursue money. And we see that Judas was even willing to betray Jesus for money. And what does Judas ask them? This is ridiculous. Judas says, "How much money are you willing to give me?" We find that in Matthew chapter 26, verse 14 to 16. And it says, Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 silver coins. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Not only was Judas willing to betray Jesus, not only was, Judas willing to take money to betray Jesus, Judas was bold enough to ask, "How much money are you going to give me to betray Jesus?" This really tells us of where Judas's mentality and his heart really was. But Judas didn't realize, I could just imagine, Judas didn't realize the symbolism that he was going to be fulfilling by betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver. It's a little bit interesting when you look at the other connections in the Bible between 30 pieces of silver and betraying someone for silver. When when Jesus was in one of the houses at in the book of John chapter 12, and he was with the disciples, a woman named Mary, remember Mary, Martha, and Lazarus? Mary comes in, bows down to the feet of Jesus, breaks open a container, an alabaster box full of very expensive oil, pours it on the feet of Jesus, and begins to wash his feet, anoint his feet. Judas gets angry because this was super expensive oil. And look at what happens in this scenario. John chapter 12, verse 4 till 6 says, "But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, 'Why was this fragrant oil not sold for,' look at this, 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Then he said, he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. So Judas Iscariot was a thief. He was the treasurer of the 12 disciples. Jesus knew all this. But look at what he says. He says, oh, it could have been sold for 300 denarii. Isn't it funny that he sold Jesus for 30 pieces? And that is exactly a tithe, or a 10% of 300. It's not a coincidence that Judas ended up, betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of what he had earlier said the oil should have been sold for. Very interesting connection. But another interesting connection is that in the Old Testament, if the two people if one person owned the animal, a bull, and that bull was to kill someone else's servant or someone else's slave, that person would have to pay the owner 30 pieces of silver. So 30 pieces of silver was a lot of money back then, was the price for someone else's servant. So Judas paid the price as if Jesus Christ was a servant, was someone else's slave, and he paid the slave's price for Jesus Christ. Very interesting connection. And last connection is that we see that when Joseph in the Old Testament, when he was sold by his own brothers, he was sold for 20 pieces of silver. You see that in Genesis chapter 37. And this was a type of what was going to happen with Jesus as well, being sold by one of his disciples. Wow, very interesting. So now Judas is looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus. We saw in the upper room when Jesus was instituting the Lord's Supper and he washed the feet of the disciples, and Judas leaves the room. Okay, he goes to the chief priest and he disappears, and now we don't see Judas going with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane because now Judas is not there. But all of a sudden, after Jesus was praying and he told the disciples to pray with him, and on the third time that Jesus came back, remember last time we studied that Jesus prayed 3 times, and every time he came back, the disciples were sleeping. And on the third time he comes back, they were sleeping. He says, okay, that's it, guys. It's not time for you guys to pray now, because now those who come to arrest me, they're coming here. So now here comes Judas with a detachment of soldiers. Okay, the word in the original language for detachment of soldiers is a very specific word that is actually connected to how the Romans used to divide up their soldiers. And this group of soldiers could include anywhere from 200 to 600 armed soldiers. So Judas comes with about at least 200 soldiers, people that were going to arrest him, a whole bunch of other Jewish leaders and all this kind of stuff. They come to Jesus to arrest Jesus. Judas set up a little signal between him and the soldiers, and he says, the one that I'm going to go kiss, that's the one. I want you to look at that in Matthew 26, verse 47 to 49. While he was still speaking, this is Jesus speaking to the disciples. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priest and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer, Judas, had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss on the cheek. This is ridiculous, right? But this is also symbolic, because the kiss on the cheek was something, it wasn't a romantic thing. In ancient days, a kiss on the cheek was a symbol and a gesture of respect, of honor, and of brotherly love. And here Judas does completely the opposite. He kisses Jesus but means the opposite. It wasn't about love. He was betraying him. And Judas says, "Greetings, Rabbi, greeting, teacher, master." And he was really doing the opposite. He was doing the opposite, and he meant the opposite. And this is what happened when Jesus Christ was betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, all the soldiers, they go to arrest Jesus. Peter has a sword. He pulls out his sword and he starts to swing, and he actually hits a guy on the ear, cutting off his ear. And he cuts off the ear. Just so happens that this guy is the servant of the high priest Caiaphas. We're going to get back into that in our next day of the devotionals. He cuts off the ear of a man, and Jesus stops the fighting. He tells everyone to stop fighting. He tells his disciples to stand down. He picks up the guy's ear, puts it back on the guy's head, and heals him on the spot. See, it's interesting that Jesus could have fought. Jesus could have encouraged the disciples to rebel against all these soldiers. I mean, they all would have died right there. But Jesus had a plan already. All this did not surprise Jesus. This was in the purpose of Jesus coming to earth for you and for me. See, Jesus was the one who called Judas. Remember that. Jesus knew Judas's heart. He knew when he called him to be one of the 12. He knew that he would betray him for the 30 pieces of silver. Jesus saw Judas's heart, his actions, and his intentions. But before the foundation of the earth, God already had a plan for Jesus to die on that cross. And all these little events were part of God's plan to send Jesus Christ to the cross. Did you know that this exact week when Jesus was supposed to go to the cross was actually prophesied over 300 years prior in the book of Daniel chapter 9 verse 26? It actually specifies, when you look at all the calculations of the weeks and the days and the years, Jesus Christ had to be crucified on that exact same week. It's no coincidence for God. So everything that happened to Jesus, Judas's betrayal, what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane, was all a plan to send Jesus to the cross. Not when Judas was born. It was designed by God before the foundations of the earth. So today we took a look at the betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane. We took a look at Judas betraying Jesus. We took a look at the events that surround Jesus going to the cross. And we see many things. We see Jesus humbling himself so that he can go to that cross for you and me. We see Jesus, the plan of God, being executed step by step, even though it meant pain and suffering and torturing and trials for Jesus. This is the things that Jesus did for you and me. In the Garden of Gethsemane, during that Holy Week, on that Thursday, the night before Jesus Christ was crucified, Jesus submitted himself to be betrayed by Judas Iscariot, to be arrested and to be brought to trial. And he did that for you and for me. I pray that you learned something today in today's devotional as we move forward learning about the events that Jesus submitted himself, that took him to the cross, his death, and his resurrection. I pray to see you in the next lesson, devotional number 8. And we're going to be talking about the trial of Jesus before Annas and Caiaphas. God bless you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.